The gavel fell with a sound that signaled the end of the world for two sisters. In the sweltering heat of the 1840s Virginia sun, Sarah and Esther stood on the auction block, their fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles turned white. They had already lost their mother to the fever and their father to a traitor from the deep South. Now, they were all that remained of a family tree that had been hacked to pieces. The man who bought them didn't look like a monster. Edgar Whitlock wore fine linen and spoke with the polished tongue of a gentleman, but his eyes were as cold as a winter grave. He didn't want laborers. He wanted a legacy of control. When they arrived at the Whitlock estate, a place where the shadows seemed to cling to the walls even at noon, Edgar led them into his private study. The room smelled of old leather and tobacco, the scent of a man who owned everything he saw. "Kneel," Edgar commanded. The word wasn't shouted. It was dropped like a stone into a well. Sarah, the older sister, felt the weight of Edgar's gaze and lowered her head first. She had seen what happened to those who stood too tall in the presence of men like Whitlock. She felt the cold floorboards press against her knees, a physical reminder of her new status. But beside her, Esther hesitated. Esther, whose spirit had always been a wildfire, kept her chin level. She looked Edgar in the eye, a silent defiance that made the air in the room turn brittle. Edgar didn't strike her. Instead, he began to circle them slowly, his boots clicking rhythmically, a sound that would soon haunt their dreams. "You belong to this house now," he said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying, intimate tone. "No one else speaks to you. No one protects you. Out there, the world is a storm. In here, I am the only shelter you have." He stopped behind Esther, leaning down until his breath stirred the stray hairs at the nape of her neck. "Sarah understands," he whispered. "She knows that survival is a quiet business." Sarah's voice was a mere thread of sound as she whispered, "Yes, sir." It was a lie, a shield she was trying to hold up for both of them. But Esther remained silent, her jaw set, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Edgar smiled, a thin, sharp expression that never reached his eyes. He reached out and tilted Esther's face up toward the dim candlelight. "That silence," he murmured, his thumb pressing into her jaw just hard enough to leave a mark. "That silence will cost you more than you can imagine. In this house, I own your words before you even think them." He stepped back, the darkness of the room swallowing his silhouette. The sisters were left on their knees, the realization sinking in that they hadn't just been bought for their labor, they had been bought to be broken. And Edgar Whitlock was a man who took great pleasure in the shattering. The first thing Edgar Whitlock did was dismantle the one thing the sisters had left, each other. He understood that courage is shared, but despair is a solitary burden. The morning after their arrival, the heavy iron bolt on their cabin door slid back with a screech that sounded like a warning. Edgar stood in the doorway, the morning sun casting a long, distorted shadow into the small room. He didn't look angry. He looked like a scientist preparing an experiment. "Sarah, you will report to the main house." "You are the head domestic," he said. Then his eyes shifted to Esther, cold and calculating. "Esther, you will remain in the smokehouse. You are to be the cure. You will work alone. You will eat alone." The sisters' hands flew toward each other by instinct, their fingers tangling in a desperate grip. They had slept side by side every night of their lives, whispered their fears in the dark, and shared their meager crusts of bread. To be separated was to be flayed alive. "Please, sir," Sarah begged, her voice cracking. "Let us work together. We'll do twice the work, I promise." "We won't speak a word, just let her stay near me." Edgar didn't argue. He simply stepped forward and struck their joined hands with the heavy brass handle of his walking stick. The blow was sudden and sharp. Esther gasped, her hand dropping as if burned. "Obedience begins with isolation," Edgar said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of her dress with a strength that brooked no resistance. He began to drag her toward the door. Esther cried out, a raw, jagged sound that tore through the quiet morning air. She tried to lung toward her sister, but two of Edgar's silent, stony-faced overseers stepped into her path, blocking her way like human walls. Edgar stopped at the threshold and leaned back toward Esther, his face inches from hers. "Your strength is each other," he whispered, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "It is a luxury you can no longer afford. Every time you look for her, remember, it is your defiance that keeps her away. I will remove the memory of her from your day until you forget you ever had a sister." Sarah was pulled into the blinding light of the courtyard, her head turning back until the door slammed shut, leaving Esther in the dim, salty darkness of the smokehouse. The isolation was immediate and suffocating. Edgar had realized that to break a person, you don't start with the body. You start by removing the person they love most. As the hours turned into days, the silence became a physical weight. Edgar would visit Esther in the smokehouse, not to speak, but just to watch her work in the shadows, making sure she knew he was the only living soul she would see. He was waiting for the silence to hollow her out, unaware that in the quiet, Esther wasn't breaking. She was listening to the heartbeat of the house, learning the rhythm of her enemy. The elegant dining room of the Whitlock estate was a place of superficial beauty, where polished silver gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the air hummed with forced pleasantries. Sarah, now clad in the plain uniform of a house servant, moved through it like a ghost. Her body was present, but her spirit felt tethered to the smokehouse where Esther toiled in solitude. Edgar had orchestrated their separation with chilling precision, understanding that the most effective way to break a bond was to force one to betray the other. Every morning, Edgar would summon Sarah to his study. He wouldn't touch her, but his words were a colder, more insidious form of violation. He would speak of Esther, painting her as weak, as defiant, as the reason for their suffering, and then he would demand that Sarah echo his lies. "Say she broke first," Edgar commanded one morning. His voice a silken thread of menace. He sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, watching Sarah with an unnerving intensity. "Say she begged for comfort. Say she cursed your name for not saving her." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the desk. Her knuckles white, each word was a shard of glass in her throat. To repeat such lies was to participate in the dismantling of her own sister's spirit, to confirm Edgar's twisted narrative. Yet the memory of Edgar's cold eyes, the unspoken threat of what would happen if she refused, paralyzed her. She pictured Esther in the smokehouse, alone and vulnerable. She broke first," Sarah whispered. The words barely audible. A tear escaped her eye, tracing a hot path down her cheek. She begged." Edgar leaned back, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Good. Sarah, you learn quickly. You understand the necessity of this. You understand that loyalty to me is the only loyalty that matters now." He knew that forcing Sarah to utter these falsehoods didn't just hurt Esther. It poisoned Sarah with guilt, binding her further to him through shame. He didn't realize that the thin walls of the elegant manor were not as soundproof as he believed. Esther, working in the adjacent kitchen that day, meticulously polishing a vast array of silver, heard everything: the soft cadence of Edgar's voice, the strained, broken whispers of her sister. Every fabricated confession was a hammer blow to her heart. But it was also a spark of incandescent fury. Esther didn't cry. Her tears had long since dried, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. She memorized the inflections in Sarah's voice, the tremor that betrayed her agony. She catalogued every lie Edgar forced her to speak in the quiet of her solitude, surrounded by the gleaming silver that symbolized Edgar's wealth and power. Esther began to assemble the pieces of their revenge. Each lie Edgar created, each betrayal he orchestrated, became a brick in the wall she was building to imprison him. She was learning not how to obey, but how to wait. The cruelty of Edgar Whitlock was a specialized science. He realized that physical pain was a blunt instrument, but the pain of a loved one was a razor. He decided to test the sisters' bond by turning their devotion into a weapon. One rainy afternoon, he summoned them both to the center of the courtyard, where the mud was thick and the air smelled of wet earth and copper. Esther had been tasked with hauling heavy crates of salt, a task designed to exhaust her body and quiet her mind. When she saw Sarah standing there, looking frail and hollow-eyed, she dropped the crate. The salt spilled into the mud, white crystals vanishing into the muck. "I won't do it anymore," Esther said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that startled the overseers. "I won't haul your salt." And I won't listen to your threats. Punish me, whip me if you must. But leave my sister out of your mouth." Edgar laughed. A dry, rattling sound. He didn't reach for a lash instead. He signaled to his head overseer, a man who moved with the mechanical indifference of a machine. "You misunderstand the rules of this house." "Esther," Edgar said, "your defiance doesn't belong to you, it belongs to Sarah," before Esther could move. The overseer grabbed Sarah. He didn't use a whip. He forced her onto her knees in the cold, biting mud, and placed a heavy wooden yoke across her shoulders, the kind used for oxen. Sarah gasped as the weight hit her, her spine bowing under the pressure. "Every minute you refuse to work, Esther." "Another stone goes into the baskets hanging from that yoke," Edgar explained, leaning against a pillar of the porch, shielded from the rain. "If you want to be a rebel, your sister will pay the price in bone and sinew if you want her to stand. You must crawl." Esther's scream was raw, a sound that tore through the rhythm of the falling rain. She lunged forward, but the overseers pinned her arms back. She watched in horror as the first heavy stones were dropped into the baskets. Sarah's face collapsed with the effort to stay upright, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. "Stop!" Esther shrieked, her pride crumbling into the dirt. "I'll do it. I'll haul the salt. I'll haul everything." "Then get to work," Edgar said, checking a gold pocket watch. "And remember this feeling every time you think of saying no. Look at her knees in the mud. You will obey to protect her, and you will hate yourself for it." Throughout the day, as Esther hauled triple her usual load, her muscles screaming and her lungs burning, she kept her eyes on Sarah, who was forced to remain yoked in the center of the yard as a living monument to Esther's failure. Edgar watched calmly from the window. Sipping tea, he thought he was teaching them the cost of rebellion. He didn't realize he was teaching them something far more dangerous, that they could survive the worst he had to offer as long as they were suffering together. The yoke on Sarah's neck was heavy, but the fire it lit in Esther's soul was hot enough to burn the entire estate to the ground. As the weeks bled into months, Edgar Whitlock grew comfortable in his cruelty. He believed he had achieved the ultimate mastery. He had convinced himself that Sarah and Esther were no longer human beings with histories, but merely instruments of his will. One evening, while Sarah was polishing the heavy silver service in the dining room and Esther was forced to stand at attention by the door, Edgar began to boast to a guest, a neighboring planter who shared his cold philosophy. "You see, George," Edgar said, swirling a glass of expensive port, "the secret is in the erasure people think you. Break them with the lash. No, you break them by convincing them they are. Property, and property has no memory. It doesn't remember a mother's face or a father's name. It only remembers the hand that feeds it and the voice that commands it." He looked toward Sarah, his eyes glinting with a sickening pride. "Look at her. She doesn't think of the past. She doesn't dream of a future. She is a vessel for my orders. She has become exactly what I designed her to be, a mirror of my authority." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her expression a perfect mask of vacancy. She had learned to retreat deep inside herself, to a place where Edgar's voice was nothing but a distant, ugly noise. But beneath that mask, every word was being etched into her mind with the precision of a diamond on glass. Esther, standing by the shadows of the doorway, did not flinch. She was the one Edgar considered the failed experiment because of her lingering defiance. But he was wrong. She wasn't defiant anymore. She was a collector. She memorized the way Edgar's voice rose when he was lying. She memorized the specific clicking sound of the safe behind the portrait in his study. She memorized the names of the men he claimed to have bribed in the local magistrate's office. "They are like the ledgers on my desk," Edgar continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in the silence. "I write on them what I wish, and I blot out what I don't like. They have no voice because they have no story." What Edgar didn't realize was that by stripping them of their humanity in his own mind, he had given them the ultimate advantage, invisibility, because he believed they had no memory. He spoke freely of his crimes. He spoke of the unfortunate fire that had cleared a neighbor's land for his expansion. He spoke of the forged signatures on the sisters' own sale papers, that had separated them from their rightful inheritance. Esther's eyes met Sarah's for a fraction of a second, a glance so fast it was invisible to the men in that look. 1,000 words were exchanged. Edgar thought he was writing on blank pages. He didn't realize he was providing the very ink they would use to sign his death warrant. He believed property couldn't remember, but the sisters were remembering everything, every insult, every crime, and every moment of his hollow victory. The atmosphere in the Whitlock manor had shifted. It was a subtle change. Like the drop in pressure before a hurricane, Edgar felt it. Though he couldn't put his finger on the source, he paced his study, his boots clicking on the hardwood. Glancing at the sisters as they moved through their chores, they were quieter than ever. Their obedience almost too perfect. One Tuesday evening, the heavy humidity of the Virginia summer hung thick in the air. Edgar was occupied with his ledgers. His back turned to the door. Sarah was polishing the brass fixtures of the fireplace, while Esther was bringing in a fresh pitcher of water for a single heartbeat. As they passed each other in the narrow hallway just outside the study, the line was crossed. They didn't stop, they didn't speak, but Sarah brushed her hand against Esther's arm. A quick, firm pressure in that touch. She passed a small, jagged piece of metal, the broken tip of a letter opener Sarah had scavenged from the trash, and then a single whispered sentence. "The cabinet is unlocked." It was enough. It was everything. Edgar stepped into the hall, his eyes narrowing. "What was that?" he snapped, his voice sharp with a sudden, clawing suspicion. He looked at Sarah, then at Esther. They stood like statues, their faces masks of subservience. "Nothing, sir," Esther replied, meeting his eyes for the first time in months. She didn't look away. There was a coldness in her gaze that made Edgar's skin prickle. "I was just telling her the water is fresh." "You've learned something," Edgar hissed, stepping into her space, trying to reclaim the psychological territory he felt slipping away. He searched her face for fear, for the old wildfire of defiance. But he found something much worse: certainty. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think a few whispered words can change what you are?" "Yes," Esther replied, her voice as steady as the ticking clock on the mantel. "I've learned how to wait." Edgar felt a flicker of genuine alarm. He had spent months trying to hollow them out, to make them property with no memory, but he realized now that he had inadvertently created something else. He had turned them into mirrors if they were quiet. It was because they were recording if they were obedient. It was because they were positioning themselves. He lunged forward, grabbing Esther's wrist and twisting it, searching for whatever Sarah might have passed her, but Esther had already tucked the metal shard into the hem of her skirt. She didn't cry out, she didn't flinch, she simply watched him with an expression of deep, detached pity. "Lock them in their separate quarters," Edgar roared to the overseers, his face flushed with a sudden, irrational panic. "No food, no light if they want to be silent. I'll give them a silence that screams." As they were dragged apart, Sarah looked back. She didn't see a master. She saw a man who was terrified of the very shadows he had created. The plan was no longer a dream. It was a clock that had already begun to strike. The separate quarters were not the victory Edgar expected by locking them away. He had hoped to break their newly discovered resolve, but he had forgotten that he had spent months training them to survive in the dark. Sarah was locked in a small, windowless pantry under the stairs of the main house. The air was stale, smelling of dry flour and rot, but instead of weeping, Sarah pressed her ear to the thin wood of the wall. She could hear the house breathing. She heard Edgar's frantic pacing in the study directly above her. She heard the clink of his glass as he drank himself into a stupor, and more importantly, she heard him arguing with the local magistrate on the porch. "I tell you, the records are sealed," Edgar shouted, his voice muffled but clear to Sarah's trained ears. "If the sisters are ever questioned about the inheritance, the papers in my safe will prove they were never meant for it." Sarah whispered through the cracks in the floorboards, a low, rhythmic chant. She knew that Esther, locked in the cold cellar beneath the smokehouse, couldn't hear her physically, but they were synchronized in spirit. "We endure," Sarah whispered to the darkness. "We endure until the weight of his own lies crushes him in the cellar." Esther sat in total blackness. She didn't need light. She used the jagged piece of metal Sarah had given her to slowly, meticulously carved into the wooden doorframe. She wasn't trying to escape. She was marking time. Every scratch was a memory Edgar tried to erase. Every notch was a crime he thought he had hidden. Edgar visited them each night, bringing a single lantern that cast monstrous shadows against the walls. He looked haggard, the paranoia eating at his composure. "Tell me what you're planning," he would hiss, shaking Sarah by the shoulders. "I know you whispered. I know you're hiding something." Sarah would only look at him with a hollow, haunting smile. "The silence doesn't protect us, Master Edgar," she said, her voice sounding like dry leaves. "It protects the truth, but the truth is getting loud, isn't it? Can't you hear it?" Edgar recoiled as if stung. He began to see their faces in the patterns of the wallpaper and hear their whispers in the whistling of the wind. Through the eaves he tried to convince himself that they were still just property, but property didn't have this kind of power. Property didn't wait with such terrifying patience. Through the walls, through the floors, and through the distance between them, the sisters communicated in a language Edgar would never understand, the language of shared suffering and a singular, burning goal. "Until he slips," Esther whispered to the damp stone walls of her cell, "until the lion trips on his own golden chain." The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, during the annual Founders' Day Gala at the Whitlock estate. Edgar, desperate to reclaim his status as the county's lion of the law, had invited the most influential families, the local magistrate, and the circuit judge. He wanted to show them that his house was in order, that he was still the man who wrote the rules. He ordered Sarah and Esther to be brought out of their cells, scrubbed clean, and dressed in fine linen to serve the guests. He thought he could use them as ornaments of his victory one last time. He leaned in close to Esther as she poured wine for the judge. "One word out of place," he threatened, "and you'll never see your sister again." But the sisters didn't speak out of place. They spoke exactly where the truth belonged. As the judge raised a glass to Edgar's impeccable character, Sarah stepped forward into the center of the ballroom. The music died, the laughter curdled. "The records are sealed," Sarah said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. It was the exact phrase Edgar had shouted in his study weeks ago. Edgar froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Sarah, get back to the kitchen," he hissed, reaching for her arm, but Esther stepped in from the other side. "If the sisters are ever questioned about the inheritance," she continued, picking up the sentence with haunting precision, "the papers in the safe behind the portrait will prove they were never meant for it." The room went deathly silent. These were Edgar's private words. His secret crimes, being fed back to him by the very property he claimed, had no memory. Every threat he had made in the dark, every confession he had boasted about while drunk, began to pour out of the sisters' mouths like a flood. They recited the dates of his forgeries. They named the merchant he had cheated. They described the hidden ledger in the study that contained the true will of their father, the will that made them free women and legal heirs to the land Edgar stood upon. "They're lying," Edgar screamed, his voice cracking. "They're slaves. They have no voice." Judge, surely you don't listen to property." But the judge was looking at the sisters' faces, the absolute, icy certainty in their eyes. He looked at the way they finished each other's sentences. A perfect bridge of testimony that no liar could manufacture. A man who fears his own furniture usually has something to hide, the judge remarked, his voice cold as iron. "And I've heard rumors about that Norfolk merchant for years." Whitlock the lion stumbled. He looked around the room and saw that his power had been a house of cards. He had assumed that by isolating them, he had silenced them instead. He had given them a lifetime of evidence. He had taught them his habits, his secrets, and his language. The very tools he used to bind them were now the keys to his prison. As the sheriff moved toward the portrait to find the safe, Edgar collapsed into a chair, his silk waistcoat stained with spilled wine. The lie had finally broken. The house he had built on their backs was falling. And for the first time in his life, Edgar Whitlock realized that those who say nothing are usually the ones who hear everything. The sun rose over the Virginia hills, casting long, golden fingers across the estate, but for the first time, the light didn't feel like a spotlight on a crime scene. It felt like a clean slate. Edgar Whitlock sat on the porch steps, stripped of his fine linen coat, his hands bound in the very iron he had once used to threaten the sisters. He was no longer the lion of the law. He was a man caught in the gears of his own corruption. Sarah and Esther stood together at the bottom of the steps. They weren't kneeling, they weren't hiding. They stood with their shoulders squared, the morning breeze pulling at their hair. In Sarah's hand was the true will, the document, recovered from behind the portrait, which proved that their father had never intended for them to be property. They were the rightful owners of their own lives. And the wealth Edgar had flaunted was built on a foundation of their stolen inheritance. Edgar looked up at them. His eyes, bloodshot and pleading, the arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell. "I gave you a home," he croaked, his voice cracking with desperation. "I fed you, I kept you safe from the world. You wouldn't have survived without me." Esther stepped forward, her shadow falling over him. "You didn't give us a home, Edgar. You gave us a cage and you didn't keep us safe. You kept us silent so you could steal our voices, but a voice is like water, no matter how deep you bury it. It eventually finds its way to the light." Sarah reached out and took Esther's hand. The grip was firm, no longer a desperate clutch of fear, but a bond of victory. "We aren't your property, and we aren't your victims," Sarah said, her voice echoing with a strength that made the remaining servants stop and listen. "We are the witnesses, and the truth doesn't belong to you anymore." As the carriage arrived to take Edgar to the county jail to await trial for forgery and kidnapping, he reached out a hand toward them, a reflex of a man who still thought he could command the world. The sisters didn't flinch. They didn't even turn back to watch him go. They walked toward the gate together. Leaving the shadow of the manor behind, they were moving toward a future where their names would be spoken with respect, and their story would be told as a warning to those who think they can build greatness on the suffering of others. The house was silent now, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of oppression. It was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed. Sarah and Esther walked through the gates as free